Okay, here we're in Chapter 2 on integers. This is Section 2.4 on multiplication and division of integers. So integers satisfy the same properties of multiplication as the whole number. So everything we did there is the same here. So there's nothing new to learn here. We just have to apply it to the integers, which means we're going to include those negative numbers to multiply by. So we have the commutative property multiplication. So if we have a and b that are integers, then we can take the a times b is the same as b times a. Okay. We have the multiplicative identity property. So if a is an integer, then we can take a times 1 and we get that a back. And then also 1 times a is equal to a too. So we can use the commutative property and change order. Now here the 1 is the multiplicative identity. We can also multiply by 0 over the multiplication by 0. So if a represents an integer, then if we take a times 0, we're going to get 0. Or if we take 0 times a, that's also 0. Then we have the associative property multiplication. So if we have a, b, and c are all integers, then we take and associate here b and c, multiply those together first, and then multiply by a. And that's the same thing as if we associate the a and b first and multiply them, and then multiply by c. So it doesn't matter which order we're multiplying. We take the last two here and then times the first one, or we take the first two and multiply by the last one. Now, the product of two positive integers, a and b, gives a times b as a positive integer. So if you take two positives, that's what we're used to as the whole numbers, and that will give us a positive number. Now, the product of a positive and a negative integer, so this is the new part because we haven't actually done anything with negatives yet. If we take a positive times a negative, so let's say if we have a is positive and b is negative, then the product of the two becomes a negative integer, okay? Because a negative times a positive is negative. Now, if a then is the negative and b is the positive instead, then we get still the same thing. We get a times b is still a negative integer. Okay. Now we still have the distribution property of multiplication. So if a, b, and c are integers, then we can take and distribute. So usually what we see is we're going to do a rainbow across like this. We'll take a times b, gives us the ab. Then whatever sign is here, plus or minus, we take a times c is ac, and then we have our plus in between. We can also multiply by a negative 1. So if a is an integer, then negative 1 times a is a negative a. Okay, so whatever a is, we change it to the opposite of it. So it's going to be, again, read this as negative a or the opposite of a. Because if a is negative here, a negative times a negative becomes positive. So it's going to be the opposite of a negative, which will become positive. And we have the product of two negative integers. So if a and b are negative, then the product a times b is going to be positive because two negatives multiplied together become positive. And then so, if negative 5 times negative 7, that gives us a positive 35. And so what happens is kind of like if we had a negative 4, that becomes positive. Well, here if we multiply a negative times a negative, what happens is that's a positive as well. So that leads us into kind of a table of like and unlike signs. So here we have unlike signs. We have a positive times a negative gives a negative. And so example, if we took 5 times a negative 4, what's that going to be? Well, that's going to be a negative 20. And we can also take a negative times a positive, and that's negative. So here we have the negative first, not second, and a negative 7 times a positive 6, that's going to be a negative 42. Now, if we have like signs, say we have plus times plus, well, that's going to be a positive. And so that'd be something like 3 times 7. Well, that's just 21. And then we can take a negative times a negative, and that's a positive. And so here we have negative 7 times negative 7. Remember, when you take a negative times a negative, that's positive, and then we get 49. Okay. So again, multiplying two negatives becomes positive. Only one, we keep it as a negative. What about even and odd? So if a product contains an even number of negatives, then the product is positive. And if the product contains an odd number of negatives, then the product is negative. So if we took, say, negative 1 times a negative 1 times a negative 1 times a negative 1, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. And 4 is an even number. And so we know that a product of an even number of negatives is positive. So 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 is just 1, and it's even, and so it's a positive one. Whereas if we had, say, maybe a -1 times -1 times -1 times -1 times -1, so now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, 5 is odd, and so because it's an odd number, we know the product is going to be negative, and again, 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 is all just 1. And so that's kind of how we can look at a simple case where we have an even number of negatives becomes positive, odd number of negatives is negative. So let's simplify some of these here and see what we get for our answers, especially for the ones where we have possibilities of, even, odd, even, odd. And here we also have, here we have 1, 2, 3, so that's an odd number. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, so that's an even number. So let's look at the first one anyway. So we have a -2 times -4 times -7. Well, if I know a negative times a negative is positive, well, then what's left? Well, I have a negative, so I know my answer is going to be negative. Now what I'm going to do? Well, I'm going to take 2 times 4, which is 8, and now I have to take that times 7, so 8 times 7 is 56. And I already know the sign is negative, so my answer then is negative 56. What about the next one? Well, again, two negatives make a positive. So what we can do is a negative times a negative is positive, and a negative times a negative is positive. What do we have left over? We have no negatives. It's all positive. So whatever our answer is, it's going to be positive. So let's do some work over here. So we'll have 3 times 4. Well, that's 12. Then we have 12 times 2. Well, that's going to be a 4. That's going to be a 2. So that's 24. So we've done that much so far. Now we have to take that times 3. So 3 times 4 is 12. Carry 1. 2 times 3 is 6. Plus 1 is 7. And so this becomes 72. And again, it's positive because we have an even number of negatives. All right, so now we have a -2 squared. So the key here is when we have -2 squared, what we're doing is we're really taking -2 times -2, okay? And so that's the key. With those parentheses around there, that squared goes directly to what's in front of there, which is the whole -2. So now we have something sort of like up here. So we have a negative times a negative. Well, that's positive. Or we could see that that's an even number. So we know our answer is going to be even or positive because the two negatives cancel. And so now we just have to take 2 times 2 and we get 4. What about the next one? A -2 cubed. Well, that just means we're going to take -2 times -2 times -2. And again, if we take a negative times a negative, that's positive, so those cancel. And that means our final answer we know is going to be negative. Well, 2 times 2 we see was 4, and we have one more there, so 2 times 4 is 8. And so then our answer to a -2 cubed is -8. Now we have it to the fourth. Well, let's take a -2 times -2 times -2 times -2 4 times. And we know that each 2 of them becomes positive. So those 2 become positive, those 2 become positive. And we know our final answer should be positive because we have an even number. And so now we have 4 of these. Well, here we had 3. So if we multiply that number, 8 times 2, that should be our answer, which is 16. And now our last one, we have a -2 times -2 times -2 times -2 times -2. Well, we have an odd number, so we should get a negative out. So let's test. 2 of them make positive, 2 more make positive, and we're left with that negative. And now we have 16 times 2, because here was 4 2's, now we have 5, so we have to take this number times 2. And if we need to, we can take 16 times 2, and that's 12. Carry 1, that's 3. And so we get -32, okay? So that's kind of showing us how we can multiply a string of numbers together, whether they're positive or negative, and we know that 2 negatives make a positive, and if we have an odd number, we get a negative number for answer. If we have an even number, we get a positive number for an answer. All right, so I'll stop there and come back in a little bit.